paper in any great degree. I'm just going to give a few remarks about it, and I think we're going to have a very lively discussion. I want to start off by talking about what struck me most about this article, which has a lot of really impressive data. The database that they've constructed is really amazing and interesting. The connection to the general theories of social revolution as well as the theories that already exist in explaining the Chinese Revolution is really rich. The argument is mainly focused on the structural conditions that led the Chinese Communist Party to defeat the Nationalist Party in light of the Japanese invasion. And they focus on state centralization and importantly, I think in a more new way, the fracturing of local elites and the turning of local elites towards the Communist Party. And so it's these structural conditions that they set up this argument that leads to communist victory in light of the Japanese invasion. In some ways, the paper as a structural analysis left me a little bit dissatisfied because it is this kind of static image of a very fast-moving period of time for China in the 1930s and throughout the 1940s. And they also have some problems with the data and inability to operationalize the concept of local elite fracture. This paper has already been published, so, you know, who cares? My comments, it's been published, and that's great. But again, putting this, thinking about how do we put this paper into an edited volume that engages in these broader debates about social revolution, how to think about the Chinese social revolution in the context of theories of social revolution that are mainly drawn from the European experience, I think is going to be really important. I also noted that in thinking about some work by some people recently at Michigan, Jeff Javid, who was a postdoc here, a PhD from Harvard, his book on land reform in China also noted that in areas where there had been more state centralization and absentee landlordism, so the kind of the elites leaving, there were much greater levels of violence during the land reform campaigns in the early 1950s. And on another country's example, Zhou's book, dissertation, which she just defended at Michigan and is about to start as an assistant professor at Harvard, looking at the Korean state's brutality during the Korean Civil War against local elites who not necessarily were communists, but certainly were nationalists and were, really caught in this important moment in this period where countries like Korea and China were struggling to modernize during a period of colonialism and imperialism, and choosing between these paths of liberalism versus communism. And so what she notes in her dissertation is that the state went after these people not because of their ideology, but because they were nationalistic and they were perceived as being anti-state or potentially anti-state. And again, it made me think about the way in which the authors in this article talk about really and sort of debunking this emphasis on peasant nationalism, something that Xiaohong talked about in his opening remarks, but rather what should really be emphasized at this important moment in time for China is the kind of the pragmatic nationalism of Chinese elites, in this case local elites in the countryside who choose the CCP after the defeat of the nationalists by Japan. And in some of the data in the paper, it's really remarkable, and you see the shift in time as the Japanese invasion increases and covers more territory, the linear sort of increase of CCP committees being set up in these areas. So in some ways, I guess, after reading this paper, what I really want to read is another paper, which won't happen with Xiaohong as author, of course, that really takes a different approach with like a more agent-based approach, I guess we would call it in political science, looking at this moment of time where elites are shifting their allegiances very quickly at key moments of crisis, of invasion, of war, of imperialism, And it struck me it's somewhat similar to struggles in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union and this third wave of democracy, as was called by Samuel Huntington, with lots of accounts of kind of the structural conditions of democratization, but in some famous work on pacting and how elites sort of made deals with each other during these key moments, and that being very important in moving towards a democratic transition. So, yeah, I would like another paper, and I guess with the data out there, I think people will be really lucky to be able to take advantage of what has already been done in this work so far. So I'm going to turn to our three panelists and introduce them just all now in order of how they'll present. And I'm just going to say their bios are all online if you go to the conference website. So I'm not going to, I mean, obviously they're online, but they're online in the conference website. So I'm not going to read everything, but just titles and some few details. Of course, that Yuhua Wang went to Michigan, very important. Not that he's now a tenured professor of government at Harvard, which is secondary to the fact that he went to Michigan. He is author of a few books, including his dissertation, Tying the Autocrat's Hand, but most recently, The Rise and Fall of Imperial China, The Social Origins of State Development. So Yuhua will be speaking first. And sorry, I have to go back and forth because I don't have these things printed out because I was trying to save paper. The second presenter will be Xueguang Zhou. Xueguang is a professor at Stanford. I'm trying to click on his bio. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous I'm doing it this way. Professor of Economic Development, Professor of Sociology, and is also a senior fellow at the Spogli Institute at Stanford. Very well-known scholar of institutional change, of Chinese society, of Chinese governance, of Chinese revolution, and a recent book that we commented on with Xiaohong online a couple of years ago now, during COVID?
Yes, 2 years ago.
2 years ago. So, and the author of one of my favorite all-time articles on Chinese politics, which is Disorganized Interests, Unorganized Interests and Collective Action. So if you haven't read that article, I definitely recommend it. It's from 1993, when many people in this room were not born. Last but not least, Mark Mizruchi, who is cited a lot in this paper for his own work on the fracturing of the American corporate elite. Mark is a professor in sociology at the University of Michigan. So study of globalization of American banking and a study of methods for measuring the effects of social network ties, a colleague of Xiaohong, and has lots to say about this paper as well. So we are going to start with Yuhua and go down from there.
Right. It's such a great honor as a political scientist to be included in this conference to honor and celebrate Xiaohong's scholarly legacy. I met with Xiaohong in 2022 for the first time during the China conference that Mary organized. And that was also the last time I met with Xiaohong. At the time, I didn't know the next time I came back to Michigan was to attend his memorial conference. I read this article several times. There are three things that struck me. First of all, just how humble Xiaohong was. The argument, as Xiaohong framed it, is what he called a Tocqueville Fay perspective. So he was, his goal, as he argued in the article, was to test Tocqueville and Fay Xiaotong's theory. If this paper was written by a group of economists, they, without knowing either Tocqueville or Fay Xiaotong, would claim that this is the first paper ever to make a new argument without citing Tocqueville, Fay Xiaotong. So that just tells you how honest Xiaohong was as a scholar. He not only tested, he was too humble that he actually didn't only test Tocqueville and Fay, he reinterpreted Tocqueville and Fay by adding this cultural dimension, which I will focus later, that hasn't been very prominent in all the following up discussions about Tocqueville and Fay Xiaotong. You know, Tocqueville made this very famous argument about state penetration, about the nobility. Those things were discussed very frequently by scholars after Tocqueville. But then Tocqueville also made this cultural argument about the nobility, their responsibility for the peasants, which wasn't picked up by scholars. I think one of the great contributions by Xiaohong is really pick this up and then add flesh to the bone and then make it very, very exciting. So he was, you know, he should have done more to sell this paper as some original ideas. The second thing I want to say is I could almost feel the pain that Xiaohong had while he was writing this paper, also publishing this paper. I believe this is the last publication that Xiaohong had before he passed away. I hope this publication gave him a lot of joy. But I also understand as scholars, we all have to go through pain in doing research, and I can feel the pain when I was reading this paper. For two reasons. One is Yan mentioned this morning that Xiaohong inherently is a Marxist, but also he is Weberian. In this paper, you can see the Marxist and then the Weberian self-inners of Xiaohong colliding each other in this one paper. So I'll elaborate. So the argument about Chinese Revolution has been, before this paper, focused on peasant revolution, right? This is, you know, a classic proletariat peasant revolution. The peasants, the workers, don't have any properties, they have nothing to lose, so when some intellectuals come, mobilize them, they join the revolution. This is, you know, from Barrington Moore, from all the Marxist accounts of Chinese Revolution. But that's not what Xiaohong found in his data. He tried to argue, no, that's not, well, that's part of the story, but actually we are missing a very important actor in the Chinese Revolution. That is the land-owning elites, the so-called the gentry, who participated very actively in the Chinese Revolution by defecting from the KMT, the Nationalist Party, to the Communist Party. And this is not about class interest, right? This is not about material interest. This is about something else that I will talk about. And that's more Weberian, right? It's more about culture, it's more about status, it's about identity. So you can really see this, you know, Xiaohong being a Marxist, right? But trying to be very honest to himself and also to the materials, who needed to decide between these two idols, the Karl Marx and Max Weber, and then he chose Weber in this particular paper and then challenged his own academic hero, Marx. So that's one of the sources of the pain of writing this article. The other source of pain, as Mary mentioned, is he didn't really have the data to fully test his theory. He has this beautiful theory about three factors, there's three variables. One is state penetration, and then elite fracturing, and then gentry culture. He had data on only two of them. He didn't have data on elite fracturing, which is the key variable, which is also the most exciting variable, I think, in this article. But he didn't have the data on that. However, he continued. Political scientists would give up the project. You know, if I were doing this project, I would give up, realizing I don't have the data. I cannot write this paper. Or, as some other political scientists, they would feed their theory to the empirics, right? So they have this funding, and then they don't have the data on elite fracturing. So what they do, they talk about other things that they have the data on, and then so they feed their theory to the data they have. But Xiaohong did neither of those, which I admire. He was truthful to his beliefs, that he believed this is the true story, although he didn't have the data. And then what he did is he said, you know, let's use all the data he had to test the implications if his theory were true, and then which point to the direction that maybe is something going on about elite fracturing. But also he did more. He did a case study using one county. He looked at the archives and then showed that, well, this is one person, this gentry leader in this one county who defected to the Communist Party. So he used qualitative materials to complement the quantitative analysis, which I also admire. But I can feel the pain, right? As a scholar, when you have this beautiful idea, but you don't have the data, what do, right? We give up, but Xiaohong continued. He had the courage to continue, and then he got this published. I'm so happy. The third thing that surprised me in this article is this very idea of the gentry. And then, as I said, right, the conventional wisdom is always, it's about the peasant rebellion from Barrington Moore, so on and so forth. It's about the proletariats. The gentry means they are the land-owning elites, right? They controlled land, they held land, they have properties. Why on earth would they support the Communist Party, who claim to have a communist utopian and then to confiscate the land of the land-owning elites, right? That's a huge puzzle, right? That's, when I read the article for the first time, I couldn't understand why the gentry did this. But as Xiaohong very convincingly showed, using both quantitative and also qualitative data, there were gentry leaders who defected, right? They used to feel they belonged to the the KMT, but now they defected to the Communist Party. So why did they do this, right? And Xiaohong provided a very innovative argument that I think, we as scholars in the social sciences should all benefit from. That is, he says, this is not about material interests, right? This is challenging the whole paradigm, at least in economics and also political science, not so much in sociology maybe, but we as political scientists, we were trained to believe people are rational actors, they calculate the benefits and costs, and then they decide according to the profit they will have from this particular action, right? So using that paradigm, the gentry should not join the Communist Party because the Communist Party says we will confiscate your land, right? But the gentry did this anyways. And then Xiaohong said, this is not about material interest. The whole revolution is not about material interest. Based on this earlier article he wrote, published at ASR, also it's not about material interest. It's about ideas, right? It's about ethos. It's about certain groups. They have identities. They have ethos. So here, the gentry felt that they were marginalized by the KMT. So what the KMT did, right? The KMT built strong grassroots state institutions that penetrated the countryside, which for the first time in Chinese history, right, for 2,000 years, in imperial China, the imperial government always had this agreement with the gentry that you govern your own countryside, I will govern the center. Then we have this collaboration, right? For 2,000 years, that was the case. The KMT broke this social contract, sort of, and then by having state agents penetrating at the very local level, down below the county level, right? And then which empowered a new class of elites. Those are the tax collectors, or the clerks, runnermen, so on and so forth. And then they are not the educated literati, right, that constituted the gentry. So now what happened in the countryside in China in the 1930s was there were two classes of elites. One is this new elites, right, the clerks, the tax collectors that are empowered by the KMT. They have a lot of formal power, right? And then you also have the gentry, who have the informal cultural authority in the countryside. They are the educated literati, right, who had been ruling China for 2,000 years. And then, but the gentry felt this is not my government, right? I don't belong to the KMT because they like those petty bureaucrats. I'm the educated literati, right? And then the CCP saw the opportunity and then came to mobilize the gentry by tailoring to their literary taste, by talking about literature, for example, in the case study, right, Xiaohong mentioned that the CCP, the communist leaders, would come to the countryside and then use their gentry names, the literary names, to call them and then respect them, right, and then co-opt them. And then that's really what mattered here. That is, the CCP was very successful in mobilizing the identity of the gentry, so that the gentry no longer care about material interests. And this is also very specific, I guess, to this particular period. That is, in the early period of the CCP, the land reform was now very radical. So it was not violent. They probably took some land, but it was not very radical. The landlords were not killed. I think those are all factors that matter. But I think the key message that Xiaohong tried to send is it's not about material interests. It's not about the economy, right? This is about identity. This is about status. This is about status culture, right? As a political scientist, I have to say I learned so much because as a political science, as a whole discipline, we only recently noticed the importance of identity and status culture. One of the puzzles that made us realize the importance of status culture and identity is when we see white people without college education overwhelmingly supporting for Trump. And then the puzzle for political science was, we usually think if you don't have college education, if you are a worker, for example, in Detroit, you should vote for the Democrats because the Democrats provide all the material benefits, right? They will give you the welfare, the health care. And then so we were so puzzled when we see white people without college education overwhelmingly voting for Trump. And then we started to realize, maybe it's not about material interests. So we have been so wrong for decades, right? And then it's maybe about identity. And then what Trump has been doing so successfully is to tailor to people's identity, right? It's about your whiteness, it's about your Americanness, it's those, you versus them, right? And then we only started to do this recently, but Xiaohong saw this very early on, and then he applied it to a very important case that happened a long time ago, right? This is not the new phenomenon. This is not a 2016 phenomenon. This is a 1930 phenomenon that Xiaohong saw. And so he applied that insight to this very important story. And then this also leads to the broader question of how Xiaohong, as a scholar, studies culture. I think we have some discussion this morning about Xiaohong being a cultural sociologist. I think that's his identity. He cares about revolution, he cares about China, but inherently he's a cultural sociologist. And you can really see in this article that this cultural variable, this status culture, is the key mechanism here. And then that really makes me think about, how political science studies culture. The question is, we no longer study culture. Unfortunately, we had a few works back in the 1960s, 1970s. There was a very famous book by Almond and Verba called Civic Culture. And then that book divided countries into three categories. And some countries are democratic culture and participatory culture, that's what they call. And then some countries are so-called subject culture or parochial culture. And then in those cultures, citizens don't feel they are the owners of the country. They're just subjects, right? And then they follow whatever the leaders say. And then they argue that if you happen to be in that category, having the parochial culture, you won't have democracy. So you don't deserve to have democracy when you have a bad culture. Basically, that's what they said. And then you can see, right, that's why we don't study culture, because by studying culture in political science, you can very quickly become a racist. That is, you very quickly say those countries are not democratic. For example, some people say China is not a democracy because it's Confucianism, right? That's inherently a racist argument. It's basically saying you have bad culture, right? You don't deserve democracy, right? Without knowing, for example, Taiwan also, is Confucian, but also it's a democracy. But Xiaohong's approach of studying culture really enlightened us because he talks about groups and group culture and group ethos and group norms, and then associated with organization, right? In this AS article earlier, he talked about the earlier communist organization and different factions within the organization. Some are more associated with the Bolshevik, right? They have the so-called ethical activism. In this article is the gentry culture, right? The gentry are they are the honorable members of the local communities, right? They don't like to see those petty clerks, right, controlling the power. And then they want to be the owner. And then that pride, that honor was what made them support the Communist Party, right? Culture here is critical in this story. So I think that's really useful for political science to think about. The last thing I want to say is I believe it's Isaac Newton who said, if we can see further, it's because we are standing up on the shoulders of giants. But very unfortunately, in the social sciences, the shoulders are usually too old and too wide. And today, I think we are very fortunate to be able to stand on the shoulders of Xiaohong. But very sadly, the shoulders are too young and too vulnerable. Thank you so much.
So first of all, I want to join all others to thank conference organizers for providing this opportunity for us to honor and celebrate Xiaohong's intellectual and academic contribution to our discipline. Xiaohong's intellectual pursuit and scholarship have touched many of us and inspired a lot of people beyond academia. I remember last December when I was in Beijing, an editor of Chinese magazine contacted me, and I have never met her before, but in the first round of our email communication, she mentioned Xiaohong. She said, recently, Xiaohong passed away. I was especially saddened by the news because she was such a pure scholar dedicated to his pursuit and deeply concerned about the well-being of the public space. And he refused to write just to please someone in a higher authority. As you can see, the editors using Xiaohong's example try to persuade me to engage in public activities. So as you can see, Xiaohong's impact really is reached far beyond the typical narrow, defined academia. So for many years, I conducted my fieldwork in China, and I published most of my work in the last few years in Chinese. And because of this, I didn't have much chance to interact with the historical sociology field, especially those who publish in the English literature. I recall that Xiaohong and I were arranged together in the Zoom panels a few times, but because of his health conditions, eventually we didn't have a chance to actually even share the same Zoom panel. And last May, I was invited to be a commentator on Xiaohong's work at another Zoom meeting, and unfortunately, we didn't have a chance to meet because his health condition would not allow him to be on that panel. So I regret not having a chance to know Xiaohong personally, but I'm very grateful for this occasion, for this conference, that allows me to get to know him through his work. And I have heard so many comments in the previous panels, and it's really provided rich images to me about Xiaohong. And Mary and Yuhua has already talked about the main aspects of this article Xiaohong co-authored with his team. And the topic of Chinese Revolution is important. As another sociologist, Franz Schumann, put it years ago, this is what he said: the Chinese Revolution is to the latter half of the 20th century what the Russian Revolution was to the first half. And as we know now, today, the Chinese Revolution's significance even continued and become more so today than ever before. And the CCP's rapid rise over a short period of time of the 8 years that covered in this study was surprising to everyone, including the CCP leaders. So is the CCP's national takeover a historical destiny or historical accident? And there are many serious questions that current theoretical frameworks on state-making, revolution, and social transformation simply has not provided satisfactory responses. And these questions are central, I think, to political sociology, comparative sociology, and historical sociology. And they are fundamental questions in sociological discipline. And Xiaohong and his collaborators made a great effort trying to address these issues. So let me just first very brief comment on the quantitative side of this study. And this work involved significant efforts in data collection, developing measures, and connecting ideas, theoretical ideas, to the variables, so-called variables in the data. For those of us who involved in conducting quantitative work, especially those of us who collected our own data, you know and we know that data collection, processing data, and preparing it into an analyzable form takes about 90% of your time and energy. So this is a tremendous undertaking. And Xiaohong and his team really combed the archival data, tracking 93 counties over multiple years, collecting data, filling data gaps, and searching for appropriate measures. And to address mechanisms that cannot be directly measured, as Yuhua talked about, they also conducted a case study to illustrate the interactive processes and mechanisms that are underpinning these processes discussed in the paper. So this is really a tremendous effort. The main contribution of this study, in my mind, is the theoretical framing. On the one hand, Xiaohong engaged in dialogues with key issues of historical and comparative sociology. On the other hand, he developed fresh, substantive theoretical arguments on the role of local elites in the Chinese Revolution, the set of issues that have been overlooked in this literature. So reading the early part, so let me elaborate on this point. Reading the early part of this article, the literature review and the theoretical motivation really reminded me the years when I first read these great works by Barrington Moore, Theodore Sketchpole, and Charles Taylor. This research project is ambitious in engaging with these great minds and fundamental issues in historical and comparative sociology. That is, what explains the major societal changes of the magnitude like the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution? And while many theoretical explanations exist for the Chinese Revolution as revealed in this article, this is the first study that I have read that built on systematic, large-scale, and micro data that try to address these issues in a quantitative manner. And this, to me, this alone makes an important contribution to the literature. And this project is not only attempts to adjudicate among multiple theoretical claims about the Chinese Revolution, but more importantly, it aims to advance a new theoretical model, what the author called the Tocqueville facial tone model that Yuhua also elaborated in his discussion. And this model tried to emphasize the role of local elite fracturing in this historical moment, and how state-making in the Republican era studied in this study eroded the local elite structure and cohesion, and generated tensions among the elites, and pushed some of them towards the CCP rebellion, shifting the balance of power. This contribution, the combination of Tocqueville and facial tone, to me, best illustrated the comparative institutional analysis that Xiaohong pursued in his intellectual inquiries and throughout his work. Tocqueville's analysis of French Revolution and the role of local elites is well known already in the literature. But Xiaohong's conceptualization that connects facial tone and Tocqueville, the Chinese Revolution and the French Revolution, really highlighted the significance of this study and put it in a comparative framework. Focusing on local elites, especially tensions and fractures among them, really requires substantive knowledge about micro processes and the social context. And this is where I think Xiaohong shines. His talent and academic training in historical sociology and his local knowledge about Chinese traditional society really has shaped the framing of this study. And Xiaohong was in a very strong position to address these issues. Theories in historical sociology, the ones I'm familiar with, often look at historical events from a long distance. And they make sense of these events through theoretical categories like class or social groups that share common interests. In contrast, research on traditional societies like Chinese traditional society has long observed distinctive forms of rural organizations. In China, gentry and kinship organizations contrast sharply with the typical class formations in the West. Xiaohong draws on facial tone's insights particularly the idea about the check and balance between the imperial state and the local elites, and the increasing local elites fracturing as the state-making efforts intensified. And this line of argument signifies, I think, significantly departs from Barrington Moore's class categories and Charles Taylor's dual processes of the centralization of the state accompanying also the centralization of class conflicts. So I think this is really substantive original ideas. I think to me, this is the most significant contribution of this study. At one level, it distinguishes itself from those arguments that focus on broad categories and larger processes, as mentioned this morning, but often these focuses often are at the expense of the endogenous processes based on cultural mechanisms at a grassroots level. Xiaohong's study instead reflects deep local knowledge about rural China's organization and the disruption of social fabric due to state-making efforts, and of course, in this case, the Japanese invasion. At another level, this study recognizes how these micro dynamics are connected to larger comparative context and theoretical issues in this field. And Xiaohong is at his best in bridging and connecting these two. So in other words, in a quantitative study like this one, this article, Xiaohong not only contributes to normal science in theory testing and accumulating knowledge, more importantly, he makes great effort to break new grounds, develop new theoretical arguments, and find his own voice in this already well-established field. As I read this article, I could not help but speculate on one additional issue. If Xiaohong had continued his research agenda in this line of research beyond the current quantitative framework, what would be his next direction and next step? I suspect that Xiaohong would delve deeper into historical research. That is, going back to historical research, seeking a better understanding of the intricate interactions among local elites and between local elites and the CCP, as he has already alluded to in the case study in that paper. In this connection, I'm reminded Xiaohong's early studies published in the ASR, where he used historical information to address the historical origins of the Chinese Communist movement. He blended a microscopic focus on local events with his sensitivity to the historical context of the early 20th century, and also with the historical theoretical interpretations that yield insights into the larger issues about communist movements in China. And his focus on the revolutionary vanguards and their organizational strategies in that study, it connects so well with this study where the CCP is struggling against the Kuomintang during this period of anti-Japanese war period. In many ways, I think this study continued his intellectual interest and the research agenda. So let me conclude by quoting another passage from Bill Skinner, the anthropologist, also the same article that published 60 years ago with the title, "What Studies of China Can Do for Social Science." In that article, Bill Skinner wrote, "While it is true that Western tradition has supplied much of the basis for the world civilization now emerging, it remains to be seen whether China will participate in that world culture in the same sense that Algeria, India, Japan, or Nigeria will. China may yet throw out a powerful challenge to the Western principles upon which the emerging international culture is based." Xiaohong's work and this study help us better understand the complexities and diversities of our world today. And I'm sure Xiaohong's work will inspire many of us, me included, to continue our intellectual endeavor in that direction. Thank you.
Well, I want to begin by saying, first of all, just thank you to Roe for inviting me to do this, to Mary, to Elizabeth, to the entire staff who put this together, to everyone who's speaking and people who came from all over, Xueguang, who never even met Xiaohong in person and yet made a trip from California. It's a real honor for me to be speaking on this panel and at this conference. I want to start out by bragging, unjustifiably, of course. I was the head of our search committee that identified Xiaohong. Now, to be perfectly honest, it didn't take any great insight to do that, to realize this was an outstanding candidate. But I was very grateful over the fact that we were able to recruit him. And I even was able to dig up my original statement to the department. You know, we evaluate all the candidates. And again, I was right on the money with all my raving. So I guess I should give myself credit for that. But, you know, I've looked through I looked through our email correspondence, and I was surprised to find there was a lot more of it than I thought there was. In fact, So my stepson married a Chinese woman 2 years ago, and my wife had heard that the groom's family is supposed to provide a gold necklace to the bride. And, you know, but we weren't sure, you know, how elaborate it should be, and whom do I ask? But of course, I turned to Xiaohong. So I asked him, you know, what we should do. So in typical Xiaohong fashion, he starts out his email, well, you know, I come from a very modest background. I don't really understand all these customs. And then he proceeded to write this practically dissertation explaining the entire history of this custom and how it had been disavowed by the Maoists, but then brought back in recent years, imported from Hong Kong and Taiwan. Anyway, that was one. There also were some really interesting comments on this heterodox economic theory, modern monetary theory. And then there was something else, which is 3 years ago. He sent me a copy of a paper, and he asked me for comments. And I took a look at the paper. He said he thought I might be interested. And I took a look at it, and I said, oh, yeah, this is really, really interesting and relevant for me, and I've got to read it. But, you know, the paper was 68 pages, and, you know, we're all busy. And I figured there's plenty of time, I'll get to it, except that there wasn't plenty of time. And I think there's a lesson there. At least I learned the lesson much too late. But it turned out the paper was the Misruling Elites. I'm really glad that I had an opportunity to read it now. And I have a lot to say about it. But, and co-authors, if you happen, I know it's 1:30 in the morning there, but if you happen to be listening, I'd love to have a conversation with you afterwards. But I want to talk about this. To say that the Misruling Elites is a big paper would be a huge understatement. This is it's a gigantic paper. It's a tome, and I mean tome in the most complimentary possible way. It's comprehensive, it's detailed, it is absolutely brilliant, and you're going to hear me throwing around these adjectives repeatedly. Not one to focus on narrow topics. Xiaohong decided to address the causes of the Chinese Revolution. And I'm not a China specialist, I'm not a specialist in revolution. I do know something about elite theory, and that turns out to play a major role in this paper. So I'm going to provide as succinct an overview as I can of the argument, and then I want to go through, raise a bunch of questions. I want to present the findings, raise a bunch of questions, and then I'll conclude. So why did the Chinese Revolution occur? Well, Xiaohong presents 6 arguments that various scholars have advanced, and then later he advances one of its own, and as we've already heard, he's overly modest on that as well because it's a very original argument, but then he attributes it to Tocqueville and Xiaotong Fei. In any case, so here are the 6 arguments. The Japanese invasion weakened the nationalist government. The communists helped the peasants fight back. They offered tangible benefits. The peasants became increasingly proletarianized. That's a 4th argument. The communists provided exceptional leadership. And then the 6th one, which is some of the peasants went into the mountains and the communists were able to recruit the peasants in the mountains, and that turned out to be an effective strategy. So anyway, what Xiaohong argues, well, you know what, these 6 arguments have never really been systematically tested. They're all based on the evidence for it all based on case studies. And then he raises another really interesting point, which is all of these assume that the local elites were cohesive. And that raises a question. What if they weren't? Now this is something, again, I don't know this literature very well, but this is a question that, in my understanding, had not been addressed before. And so how are we going to address this? Basically what he's got is, he's got 7 arguments that he's got to test on one case. But so anyway, what he does is he develops his own account. And again, he attributes this idea to a 20th century Chinese scholar, Fei Xiaodong, but also, believe it or not, to Tocqueville, which very interesting combination. But again, I think he sells himself short here. It is a very original argument. And the claim that he makes is there was conflict between the increasingly aggressive state officials in the villages and the old declining landed gentry, and that this fracturing within the elite helped create the conditions for the revolution. And then what he also points out is so the gentry, having lost their status, found themselves aligning with the communists. Okay? So this is a fascinating and completely counterintuitive argument because he's basically saying the landlords end up on the side of the communists. But here's the question. You've got, as I said, you've got 7 accounts and we've got a single case. So how do you test this possibly in any systematic way? And the answer is something after my own heart, quantitatively. But then, okay, you're going to look at this quantitatively. How are you going to do that? And the way he does it is just, I'm in awe of how he actually put this thing together. Those of you who do quantitative work, even if we're working with contemporary data, where you've got your own data set and you've got custom designed questions to address the exact problem that you're trying to deal with, trying to do this for historical data from 1937 to 1945, and then, on such a difficult case, it's just, an incredibly difficult problem and project. And yet, Xiaohong manages to pull it off. And the way he does it is he focuses on the county level. And it turns out they're able to identify data on 93 different counties. And then the question is, okay, in some of these cases, the communists experienced success, and in some of them they didn't. So let's try to identify the factors that predict the success of the communists. And so anyway, he looked at these data over 9 years, and he's got 93 counties, and there's some missing data. But what it means is he's got 744 county years. So that's, a decent-sized data set. And with those data and some pretty impressive analytics, Xiaohong and his co-authors set about to test these 7 explanations. So what do they find? Well, okay, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but the Japanese invasion clearly weakened the nationalist government. The communists did offer tangible benefits with land tax and rent policies. Some of the others, though, the argument that the peasants were increasingly proletarianized as opposed to being tillers, that one didn't hold up. The only other one that appeared to provide support was that the party provided exceptional leadership, and that there was support for that, but only under conditions where there also was Japanese invasion. Okay, so what about his own argument? So basically his take is the only one there's really clear support for is the Japanese invasion account. And even the other two that seem to suggest, these are more structural arguments about the role of the communists. He says, well, this could have actually been due to reverse causality. So he's not willing to even fully concede those. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in a minute. Now, then there's his own explanation. And it turns out Xiaohong looks at three key variables. One is state penetration, and the indicator they use is nationalist organized militia, then the extent to which the state was extracting excess taxes from the population, and then something he calls gentry culture legacy, which is basically, was there, this historical presence of the gentry in the particular community that had its own imprinting kinds of effects. And what he finds is he gets support for all three of these predictions. And then he even, it's true he didn't have direct data on elite fracturing, but they do some very clever kind of analytical gymnastics here and come up with this mediation analysis where they're able to at least suggest that we had an indirect effect of gentry culture legacy on Communist Party strength through elite fracturing. Okay, so great findings, great argument, and I want to say a few things about both of them. First of all, he's dealing with an extremely complex substantive problem and a very, very difficult set of analytics. And, Xiaohong's effort to address these multiple explanations is nothing short of ingenious. It's just, I was just blown away by this. I want to raise 4 issues, and I raise them in terms of questions. Again, if the co-authors are listening, I'd love to discuss this at some point. Hopefully some of you might have some reactions as well. But the first question is, whoops, I'm back here. So with regard to the landed gentry, okay, it's a very counterintuitive argument. It's not something I would have ever expected. And the reason that I wouldn't have expected it goes back for me many, many years ago, long before almost all of you were probably born, when I was in graduate school. And I read this book that I thought everyone would have heard of, but actually turned out at dinner last night that everyone hadn't heard of it. But there was an old book originally written in the 50s and then reissued in the 1970s, I think, by a journalist named Jack Belden called China Shakes the World. And I remember reading this in graduate school, and the story is the communists would come into the village, they'd rile up the peasants who were really, really angry at the landlords. They'd string up the landlords, and each peasant would come up. They'd talk to the landlord about some outrageous thing the landlord had done, and whammo, they'd smash him. And, here I was, a grad student, many, many years ago, and I'm like, yeah, get him. The thing about it, though, is the landlords were the bad guys, right? The communists would come into town, they'd rile up the peasants against the landlords. Okay, this was a journalistic account. I don't know what the serious China specialists think about this, but it doesn't give the sense that the landlords were on the side of the communists. And so I guess my question is, was this an isolated thing? Was he cherry-picking cases? It's very, as I said, counterintuitive to me that the landlords would have eventually sided with the communists, but it didn't fit with my conception of how things would have worked. Okay, the second question, I have 2 much smaller points. One is that, so one of Xiaohong's arguments is that from this Tocqueville-Fay model, when the state extracted more resources from the peasants, it increased the likelihood of communist support. The idea is you take away the resources, the peasants get upset, they support the communists. Well, I think it's a totally plausible argument, but at the University of Michigan many years ago, one of our beloved late colleague, Mayer Zald, came up with a theory that became known as resource mobilization theory. And in resource mobilization, the argument would have been exactly the opposite. If you're going to rebel, you got to have resources. And so if the state comes and takes all your resources away, you're weak and you can't get your act together. Now, one possible counter to that is, well, the communists came into town and they provided those resources. But again, I'd like to, I wish I could hear more about that. The third thing is the argument about elite fracturing. And I just want to make a small observation here. An elite can be fragmented or fractured, or it can have internal conflict. And sometimes those are the same thing, and sometimes they're not. So you can have situations where a group is fragmented, and it's actually more difficult to revolt against them because you can't find them. You don't even know who they are. Now, when they're directly in conflict, then you can side with one against the other. And I think that's what Xiaohong was talking about here. But again, this is a question that, I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about. And then finally, I want to get to my last point here. And that is, there's some analytical issues in this analysis, in this study. So Xiaohong and his co-authors were faced with an extremely difficult task. They had 93 counties over 9 years, so they've got this N of 744. Some missing data, because 93 times 9 is, 800 and something. But what it means is the 744 observations were not statistically independent. And so you have to deal with this. The way they dealt with it is through something called a fixed effects model, where what they did is they controlled for every county and every year. But what this meant was that they weren't able to consider any cross-county variation. All of the variation they're looking at is within a particular county over this 9-year period, making it very, very difficult to find any effects when all you've got is these 9 years within a single county. So it's an extremely conservative analysis. That's the first point. The good part about that is any effects that they find in their analysis have got to be pretty strong. I mean, if you can get findings under those conditions, you've got a pretty powerful argument and pretty powerful set of data. The problem is that several of their variables were county specific. And because they're already controlling for the county, and also they didn't change over time. And so because they're already controlling for the county with these fixed effects, they can't measure a lot of these county variables that were critical to their analysis. And so what they do, and they realize this, and they realize this is a difficulty. So what they do is they run a bunch of interaction terms. And it turns out that there are there are a lot of misinterpretations of the findings. And so, for those of you who don't know, an interaction effect, if you looked at the effect of education on income, and you looked at it for men and women, and the effect is different for men than it is for women, you'd have an interaction effect. And so what you need when you do this is you have to have the effect for education, you have to have the effect for gender, and then you have the product of the two, that's the interaction. But what Xiaohong and his colleagues did is they took the three variables, state penetration, excess tax, and gentry legacy, and they interacted it with whether Japan invaded the country. But they didn't, and they included whether Japan invaded the country, but they didn't include the main effects for those three variables. So what happened is they never really tested the effects of them. And so you know that if Japan invaded, the effect is greater for counties that had these three properties, but you don't know what those effects were in the first place. And so, and then there's the same problem with, let's see. in the first analysis, there's a similar problem. So the second thing is, and again, he's aware of this problem and talks about it, that you can get when you've got time series data, you can get reverse causality. And so what he does is he says, well, the independent variable, you got to make sure the independent variable comes first in time because that's going to predict the dependent variable. And it's a totally reasonable, sensible strategy. The problem is that you don't know if that lagged independent variable last year wasn't affected by the dependent variable in the previous year. So you can't really address reverse causality by just lagging the independent variable. So anyway, we don't really know what the findings are. But none of this means that the argument's wrong for a number of reasons. The fact is we don't know what the actual results would have been. And I would love to get my hands on that data set. This is one reason I'm so disappointed that I hadn't read the paper earlier so we could have discussed this. There are lots and lots of things that they actually could do. But the key thing I want to point out is none of these analytical problems provide any suggestion or indication that his argument is wrong. We just don't know for sure that it's right. I will say that I think he's right just because, well, there are a lot of reasons I think he's right. One is you look at the case study, and the case study makes a lot of sense. It seems consistent with the argument. The other thing is that there are several other people who have made similar arguments about elite fracturing. Some of the leading historical sociologists in our field, Richard Lockman, Roger Gould, Peter Behrman, those are the leading ones, and then there are others. So I think there's a really good chance that he's right. I just think that, again, they're dealing with a very difficult situation. They did as much as I think they could have done with what they had, but there are some alternatives that they could have used. And I'm not going to go into all the technical details, but again, I'd love to, if you're listening, co-authors, let's talk about reanalyzing some of the data. Which brings me to my conclusion. This paper, as far as I'm concerned, is just the beginning of what should be a real long-term project. There's so much more that can be done, not just with this data set and this particular paper, but with the entire argument, which I just think is original, it's counterintuitive, it's everything that you would want. You talk to your students about what makes a great project. Everything that makes a great project is in this paper. And I think we have a responsibility, not just to Xiaohong, but to ourselves to continue this work. So, thank you.
We have some time for questions. Just please wait for the microphone so that people online can hear you.
Hi. This question, thank you to all the panelists. And this question is for Professor Wang. Thank you so much for talking to us about how Xiaohong's work enlightened us as political scientists. And I wanted to ask you if you have any suggestions on how political scientists can navigate this dynamic of potentially some challenges when they try to integrate perspective from a different discipline or perhaps understudy area in the world into challenging or speaking with the already existing paradigms and theories in the field of political science, especially for earlier career scholars. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks, Siwu from Boston University. I listened to the conversation this morning. I think that in political science, I think Mary can correct me, we still don't have this problem of avoiding colonialist arguments or post-colonial arguments. I think we are happy as China scholar using so-called Western theories. And for me, I think it's primarily because we think there are some general patterns in human behavior and also in political institutions that are universal across societies. For example, the logic of collective action, right? If you think about the Mancur-Olson's logic of collective action, it's everywhere. It doesn't matter whether you're Chinese or Japanese or in Africa, you have the problem of collective action. And then I think that, so I usually encourage my students to know those classics. Instead of saying those are colonialist or post-colonialist, we need to know what they say, and then think very hard about whether their arguments, which are generated, I agree, from the Western societies, can explain what we care about, for example, in China. And but the first thing, as a young scholar, is to be exposed to those ideas, rather than say those are bad ideas, white people's ideas. I'm not gonna read. So I think the first thing is read, just know those arguments, and then think hard about the connections between the theories and then the context that you study.
I really enjoy your brilliant analysis. Among all the publications by Xiaohong, I like 2 papers. This is one of them a lot. In the spirit of Mark's list of the questions, I also add 2. One is empirically the regression models. I suspect some counties, when they are collapsed, defected to communism, they should be taken out from the sample. So to Xueguang particularly, you teach event history analysis. Is the Hathaway model better? That's my one technical question. Another question is to all of you. He criticized 6 lines of argument, and many of this original argument was raised at the national level. And he's testing at the county level. The dynamic could be different.
Yeah, you're right that with the dummy variables, it would have, the model will automatically get rid of some of the main effects, and the main effects are in the dummy variables. The problem is they never get analyzed, so we don't know what they are. And that was, they're in there, but we don't know, we could have looked at the dummy variables, but that would have been really complicated. So there are other ways to do it. He could have run random effect, get rid of the dummy variables altogether, run random effects, cluster on the counties, which he did. They didn't need to even run the fixed effects. So there were ways they could have looked at the main effects without, without doing what they did. I've had to deal with this issue a lot. You're making an argument about the entire country, and now they're breaking it down into counties. I don't see how else they could have answered that question. You've got one case, right? You have this revolution that happened in 1949. But substantively, there is variation about where the communists are stronger or weaker. And it's hard to imagine there's not some connection between what's causing that and what ultimately led to the revolution being successful. So I don't think there's any problem at all. There's going to be some slippage there. It's entirely probable that some of the counties where the communists were very strong would not have been the ones ultimately, where the party triumphed. But I think the logic of the way they set that up is pretty seamless in my take. I don't know what the others think, but I bought it.
If I can just add to Yang's question. First, I think it is, in effect, event history analysis. It's a multiple year, dependent variables binary, and the variables are updated through the years because they are what we call time varying covariates. Yeah. So in that sense, I agree with Mark that it does not present a problem in methodology in terms of dropping the dependent variable over the years. As you said, as soon as a county, so-called 县委, party committees set up, that data is drop out, right? So events completed, it's no longer in the risk set. So that's one response. I think your second question, observation is really important. Previous studies focus on peasant revolutions really at a national level. And that's why if you think about local, the elite fracturing, it is really at the intermediate levels. You have to come down to that level to do this kind of analysis. And that's why I think this study, I think, makes really a major contribution because it moved down to a level that allows us to speak to these kind of variations at the local level. And we can see a lot about other aspects of the data collection, whatever, because data at that level is hard to get. But I think this is really a tremendous step moving forward to address exactly the kind of theoretical questions they want to address.
We're a little bit over, but we started late. So is there any one or two last questions?
I don't have a question, I just have one comment. I think, Professor Xueguang, I want to correct you. You meet Xiaohong at least once virtually.
Virtually, okay.
In the Zhejiang University Max Weber 100-year days anniversary, conference on June 14th, 2020.
It's very precise. One more question right here, and then we'll close.
Hi. No, I think I just want to add, I'm Gary from New School. Just want to add some kind of meta commentary that kind of links the last panel to the other. And partly in response to Yan's kind of very provocative commentary on post-colonial theory and Xiaohong's kind of orientation or disposition within, in relation to like comparative historical. In a sense, I think there's something profoundly critical about the theoretical framing of this piece. In that, like, if you read Barrington Moore, Fei Xiaotong is actually part of the sources that secondary sources he consults, right? So, a Chinese author, a Chinese sociologist is treated as subject material, a secondary source to be raked over for the sake of theorization. There's something quite profoundly critical here, where Fei Xiaotong and Tocqueville are actually both sources of Xiaohong's theoretical framing. In that sense, politically, I kind of sense that, yeah, I mean, in a way, I think maybe the methodological kind of like move by post-colonial theorists may not necessarily cohere or kind of align with Xiaohong's kind of own politics very neatly, but in a sense, like politically, there is a very, very subtle theoretical critique at play. In this, one could say, like, I would certainly try to do this, which is like you could read Barrington Moore and then turn to Misruling elites as a response. And that profoundly kind of reshapes how people might think, like how comparative historical sociology works, or rather can remake itself in ways that are more equitable. So this is perhaps more commentary than a question. But thank you to the panelists.
Can I just
Sure,
say
go
one
ahead.
thing in response? I think one tricky aspect of this is that Barrington Moore's dependent variable is not the same as Xiaohong's dependent variable. And the question is, how would Communist Party strength fit into the Barrington Moore analysis? And, well, I mean, he talks about communists, but in this particular case, it's a little tough to make that comparison.
Right, but I think like in terms of the characterization of the landed gentry,